So, I will now hand over to Milford. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Yep. Thank you very much for turning up. I see some faces that I recognise from various other activities. So I'm very glad that people took the time to turn up. And a lot of faces I don't recognise, but this is, as Karen said, this is just my second week at ODI, so this is all quite new to me about how ODI works and the sort of procedures and methodologies. But I'll try to carry on. The book, I should say, comes out of many years of watching and observing and then working in the microfinance or small business sector. So it was something that was on my thoughts for quite a long time, and eventually I decided I got so worked up about it, I decided I'd better take some time off and put something down on paper, and that's basically what I did. All I'm going to do now is just speak a little bit about some of the things in the book. And for some people, this is obviously going to be completely well-known stuff, nothing controversial at all, but hang in there. For some people, it will be a little bit new, but and it gets a bit more difficult as we move along. So very quickly, I think we're all familiar with the history of microfinance and its origins in India, Pakistan, and then Bangladesh. Particularly people like Hamid Khan developing microcredit in the 1960s. Professor Mohammed Yunus then came along and started to develop his own ideas for microcredit, and this was the idea that was then pitched to the international donor community in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Starting the Grameen Bank then in the early 1980s, and the initial idea was to lend to the poor for income-generating activities. Now that's very important because later on microcredit branched out into microfinance and into all sorts of other areas. But the original idea was about income-generating activities funded with microcredit. And we have there the famous phrase that poverty will be eradicated in a generation, and the kids will have to go to a poverty museum to see what all the problems were about. So the international donors fell in love with microfinance. It was a form of non-state, self-help, fiscally responsible type of help, and it centrally positioned individual entrepreneurship as the way out of poverty. And that was just music to their ears at the time, as I'll come on to when I talk about the political rationale for microfinance. And initially, supposedly very high repayment rates in Grameen meant that the actual cost of supporting Grameen and banks like Grameen, microfinance institutions like Grameen, meant that the poor could actually be supported at quite cheap levels because the poor were bankable. They mainly repaid the loans that they were getting. So that was the 1970s and 80s. Moving on into the neoliberal, the sort of Washington consensus 1980s, and we see a slightly different development. Because in the 1980s, the World Bank and the IMF, USAID, the mainstream development agencies, were pushing what was called the full cost recovery mantra. And so they were interested in interventions and those using particular interventions, covering the full costs of those interventions. So this became the standard dogma or ideas within the main international development agencies, and the idea was that the poor must pay the full costs of any services given to them. Whether we're talking about microfinance, whether we're talking about business development services, health, education, full cost meant that basically you paid the full cost of whatever services you accessed. And microfinance was not going to be any exception. So in that sense, we might talk about microfinance being neoliberalized in the 1980s under the influence of the international development community. Now, the two main institutions that pushed forward this neoliberalization were SÍGUENOS, the consultative group to assist the poorest, which is based within the World Bank in some sort of multi-stakeholder structure, and then, of course, USAID. And they pushed what I've called the new wave microfinance model forward, which was a very commercialized model where microfinance institutions are basically structured as for-profit institutions and incentivized as other other private businesses would be incentivized. And this became the best practice in the 1990s, and it eventually ended up replacing the Grameen Bank as the best practice model. So, however, by the late 2000s, it became clear that we were having a few problems. And it became clear to many people that microfinance wasn't doing what it actually said on the tin. It wasn't actually reducing poverty and deprivation and marginalisation as was initially promised. And many people started to think that it was a bit more talk and not so much walk. So that opened up the scope for a lot more people to start to actually understand how microfinance worked as a development intervention and to look on their own terms at what was really going on. And eventually it seemed that a paradigm shift was actually starting to get underway. Now, to get to the core, and I'll run through this very quickly because we don't have much time, but why is it that microfinance, the Grameen Bank original idea, was particularly bad for as a development intervention? Well, the first thing is that it doesn't have any attention to minimum efficient scale. Microfinance obviously supports micro-enterprises, but if those particular type of enterprises are not really what an economy requires, then there is a problem there because they're supporting, in a sense, the wrong type of institution, the wrong type of enterprise. And one of the problems with supporting micro-enterprises, most of which are below minimum efficient scale, is that most of them end up collapsing. So you get some pretty bad figures. I mean, my work in Bosnia, looking at microfinance there, pointed to a very high client failure rate. And we come across some World Bank figures that basically prove that. In India, we have similar stories of clients failing after a year or two. And the problem with failure, of course, is that there is a big likelihood that you end up being plunged into even deeper poverty than before you access the microfinance. So we can't ignore that particular aspect. Another big problem on this in terms of the minimum efficient scale argument relates to farming and agriculture. Microfinance has entered into the agricultural sector, but mainly to support subsistence farms. And it's not very easy to make a subsistence farm pay when you're having to repay 30 to 40% interest rates on any small microcredit that you took out. The two things don't basically go together. So there's created a huge problem. In many parts of India, for example, there is a microcredit oversupply for the agricultural sector. And this has created huge problems for the Indian government and for the government of Andhra Pradesh. And among other things, that has resulted in poverty rising in the most microfinance saturated state as opposed to falling. So we come to what Thomas Dichter has called a paradox, where the poorest people can't really do very much with a microcredit, and the people that can do something with a small credit are the ones that don't actually get the credit and don't get it on affordable terms and conditions. So that's one aspect there. Another issue that we have to look at is this issue of the fallacy of composition. And this is about looking at one particular isolated example and then assuming that you can scale up that to the level of the locality or the region or the nation. And it simply doesn't work like that. And particularly in terms of micro-enterprises, when we have most localities already pretty much oversupplied with very simple goods and services produced by micro enterprises, and then microfinance basically increasing that supply, you have a very high displacement rate, which is basically one micro enterprise producing, selling basic goods or video hire or hairdressing, displacing the micro enterprise located next door. So there's a very high displacement rate, and that suggests that the simple number of new or expanded micro-enterprises thanks to microfinance isn't the whole picture. There's actually a very, very serious downside, which of course is not really discussed. There are two aspects to the downside. In terms of the oversupply, then we clearly get a local price fall, and you see that in all microfinance saturated localities, and of course clients and non-clients suffer equally. And then basically as the available demand at the local level is subdivided between all the micro-enterprise participants, then obviously turnover falls, which means profit falls, which which means profits and wages fall at the same time. So it's a problem which needs some evaluation and some analysis, but it's something that basically is just skimmed over. Another area, and I'll come on to this, where there's been a very good study just released this week on this. Morgenthau plan is the plan that was developed for Germany during the Second World War in order to impoverish the German economy so that it would never have any part in it would never be able to threaten world peace afterwards. And in many respects, you could actually say that microfinance is a sort of a quasi-Morgenthau plan, because the Morgenthau plan was all about getting rid of all large and medium enterprises and having only small enterprises with no innovation or technology component. So it was about impoverishing the German economy. And in many respects, that's actually quite how microfinance works. In other countries, I mean, I came across this phrase, Africanization, Africanization, which is a phrase I came across many times working in the Balkans, and they understand that their economy has been transformed from a reasonably developed economy based on some large enterprises, some medium and some small, and it's moving down the value chain, moving down to be basically composed of very tiny micro enterprises with no real growth potential. And that's something that they are very afraid of. And they call it a programmed return to 19th century ways of living. I'm going to have to skim through this a little bit faster. One aspect, I mean, that's clearly an important aspect in the development, or rather the underdevelopment of the African continent, because it really has led the African continent down into a development dead end with the overemphasis on the microfinance leading to micro enterprises as opposed to enterprises which are sustainable. And the final one is that we all understand that local economies are very, local economies, if we want local economies to develop, they have to develop the interconnections between vertical and the horizontal interconnections. There's a huge literature on this and many good development practices, but of course micro enterprises are really not the suitable material to start making those interlinkages. In terms of the agricultural sector in particular, well, microfinance is simply not suitable for minimum efficient scale farms, which is really the new agenda in agriculture now for economic, social, environmental, ecological reasons now. It simply isn't an appropriate form of financial support for the most productive farms, but it's the sort of financial support that most farms are going to get whether you want it or not. So there's a disjuncture there. So what we end up finding is that most tiny, what we call postage stamp farms are basically bowled over with offers of microfinance, but the farms that could really use small farmer credit basically go without. And we can see that in Bangladesh, particularly in India. We can see that in Mexico, in Bolivia. Most of the microfinance saturated countries have that real problem that the tiniest postage stamp farms get as much microcredit that they want and they can't service it because they're unproductive, whereas the small family farms basically don't get anything. And the other infrastructures of support, such as agricultural cooperatives, basically they go without finance as well. Microfinance extends informality. We know that. If they didn't deal with informal businesses, they would have to shut shop within a couple of months. So we know that. And that brings with it a whole train of negative effects in terms of legitimizing bad business, illegality, avoidance of taxes, etc., etc. And it basically undermines the growth of the informal sector because it creates a form of unfair competition and takes market share when in fact it shouldn't do. So my conclusion, certainly from the whole potentially transformative capacity of the microfinance sector and microenterprises, is that there isn't really any. So in that sense, Hernando de Soto was really quite wrong in what he was saying. So in terms of social capital and solidarity, which we now understand are very important aspects of rebuilding sustainable local economies, particularly in the aftermath of war, in the aftermath of natural disasters, basically it doesn't actually have any effect there other than a negative effect by social pressures to repay, and so there's no real social solidarity building when you end up with microfinance, It's a sort of a dog-eat-dog world of repayment and pressure and threats. And governments have cottoned on to the use of microfinance in terms of being able to cut down important infrastructures for the poor, and then passing the responsibility over the poor and saying, well, you've got microfinance, so you deal with it now. Going on to the empowerment arguments, that's a supremely disempowering argument, but it's used quite a lot by many governments with a very substantial microfinance sector. So, I mean, there's a connection clearly between microfinance leading to informality, leading to social violence, and that's really an aspect of destroying solidarity there. Oof, I've written too much here. Okay, so that was the basic Grameen Bank model. And as I said, in the 1980s and 90s, the Washington-based institutions then came on the scene to try to neoliberalize microfinance, to turn it into a commercial offer so that the poor were going to be paying the full cost of the microfinance offer. So that was absolutely paramount. And in its train, that brought with it a second set of problems which undermined any potential impact that microfinance was going to have. Obviously, we have high interest rates. That's all over the most microfinance saturated countries. But the problem with that, of course, is that, well, the microfinance institution can survive on high interest rates, but the problem is that the enterprise structure all around is actually undermined because there's no real business projects that can pay 30 to 40 to 50% interest rates. So you basically impoverish the local economy as you actually manage to survive. So you're basically constructing a cathedral in the desert, to use a phrase that was quite popular a couple of years ago. Now, interestingly, one of the justifications for these high interest rates is that running costs of microfinance are very high. But when you actually dig down into the data, as some people have done, you actually find that, well, actually one of the single biggest running costs of many of the most commercialized microfinance institutions is actually the cost of the senior management. And for example, if you look at Compartamos and then this latest example, SKS, you find that actually these people are paying themselves a shed load of money. Now, whether that's actually part of the spirit of microfinance, that's you've got a moral argument there. But even leaving that aside, you have a very practical argument in the sense that that's taking up money. So the price of having high interest rates is actually that the money is actually being taken up from the bottom. Another justification of the high interest rates is that through sustainable institutions, then they can extend the outreach of microfinance. But there's a very, very shaky moral imperative at play there, because what it basically means is that you're asking very, very poor people to pay 60% interest rates in order that some other equally poor people somewhere else will have the benefit of microfinance. So I think that is I don't think it's a very fair, it's not an equitable solution, quite apart from the fact that whether microfinance actually works to help people escape poverty. And finally, there's very little historical evidence that a high interest rate regime actually creates sustainable development. If there were examples where this took place, then that would be an important argument in its favor. But there actually isn't very much evidence for that. And of course, Western European practice in the last century, in this century, and the East Asian tiger economies, is that the deployment of below market cost finance was actually a very important part of the development success that they had. I added this 2 days ago because the book is out now, but a couple of things came up. The IPO that's taking place in SKS, I thought the Compartamos episode really was the high point in terms of what it said as how microfinance actually works in terms of the greed and the vulgarity and the inefficiency of what has happened. But I think what's happening in India, from what I'm reading, is actually becoming something even worse. So I'm a bit angry that I never actually got around to putting that in. Just a couple of days ago, a new book came out, which I was totally unaware of, The Age of Productivity, Transforming Economies from the Bottom Up. This would have been a great reference for many of the arguments I'm making, because its basic conclusion is that Latin America has suffered underdevelopment and high poverty because it is basically channeling its financial resources into the wrong types of enterprises. it's channeling them into micro enterprises and self-employment and not into small and medium enterprises where there is some productivity raising potential and technology and innovation. That's its central message. And this is IADB, this is a mainstream development bank, and that is a very radical message, and I missed it in the book. But it certainly adds further evidence to the idea of an iron law of microfinance, which is basically the more microfinance you have, the more likelihood that you'll remain trapped in poverty. And this is one of the transmission mechanisms that they highlight. The other thing I missed was this issue of Malawi. I really didn't read into that enough to look at how they have been able to transform the agricultural sector through careful subsidization of certain key inputs like fertilizer and seeds. Now, the important aspect that I read into that was that for many years, the poor farmers in Malawi had been encouraged to use microcredit to buy these fertilizer and seeds, but of course they hadn't because they couldn't service the high interest rates, so they basically didn't do it. And so obviously something comes along and changes all that. So that, in a sense, highlights how disconnected microfinance is from a sustainable development of the agricultural sector. Finally, okay, so the obvious question to ask is that, well, okay, I mean, if microfinance doesn't actually work, why is there so much international donor community support for it? So this takes me on to, and it's a very short chapter, but I had to discuss then the politics of microfinance. And there are just a few areas, and I touched upon one at the start of when I was talking, which is the international donor community loved the message that Grameen Bank and others like it was saying, which was all about self-help, individual entrepreneurship, and the poor being responsible. And what that means, responsible, is not asking the state for welfare programs, for special support, for wealth redistribution. My goodness, no, they're not supposed to ask for that. And all sorts of other issues that the poor have used historically to escape poverty. But if you get microfinance, you can be encouraged to do it on your own, and business and political elites can stand back and just basically say, okay, we can rest easy, guys. We're not going to have any threat from the developing countries. So that's one reason for that. Obviously, the Washington institutions also have to encourage financial institutions to stand on their own 2 feet. So, of course, if microfinance institutions can stand on their own 2 feet very publicly, even though the development impact might actually be very negative, but we'll leave that aside. If they can survive on market-based interest rates, this sends out a very powerful message to other banks that you are going to have to forget about any idea of subsidies. So development banks off the agenda, and you can all learn to survive on your own activities, your own business activities, just like the Grameen Bank and others like it did. So that sent out a very important message. And a final message, and I think this comes, is that the poor have to rely on the market, not the state, not social mobilization or their collective power, the numbers, but they rely on their own individual activities mediated through the market. And that's where some ideas come that the microfinance is more about getting the poor to accept the market as the final judge about whether they live or die, rather than actually do something about it through their collective power. So that's very important. What that actually says is that microfinance is really more about empowering the market than it is about empowering poor individuals. So that, and particularly in the case of women. Final slide. So why didn't impact evaluations pick up on this? And that's one of the things I'd like to do when I came to ODI. I want to look at 2 in particular. I mentioned one already, this issue of job displacement. So if we have new micro enterprises putting out of business old ones sat next to them in the street, what's the net effect there? Let's have a look at that. And then obviously client failure. We need to know, if you start a micro enterprise in 4 years' time, are you in much deeper poverty than before? If we know that, then we can start to think about things like conditional cash transfers, or saying, well, don't do that and we'll try and get you involved in a small enterprise as an employee. There are ways around it. Finally, my conclusion then. Well, clearly, microfinance is a major misdirection of scarce funds. That's savings, remittances, donor funds, government funds, commercial funds, and time. In other words, there's a huge opportunity cost to microfinance. And in a sense, in the book I've written, that it's a misallocation of resources similar to central planning. That was a plan-driven misallocation of resources. microfinance is a market-driven misallocation of resources. They're at the opposite ends of the state planning, the planning market spectrum, but they're equally underperforming. And what we find is that microfinance basically institutionalizes poverty and underdevelopment rather than actually resolves it. Another thing you find is that lessons from previous examples of sustainable development are basically not taken on board. And that leads me to believe that it's another example of what Hajun writes in terms of kicking away the ladder, that the policies that we use, the financial sector policies we use, the developing countries, the developed countries and the East Asian tigers, the policies we use to escape poverty, we're not actually going to permit the developing countries to use. So that seems to me like it's another example of the sort of kicking away the ladder idea that Hajun developed in several of his books. And then, of course, commercialization, neoliberalization comes along, and that's the final nail in the coffin of microfinance. It's all about sustainable microfinance institutions and increasingly profitability and IPOs and salaries and bonuses. It's not about development or poverty reduction. That's the PR department deals with that side of it. And so microfinance basically acts to disempower the collective capabilities that the poor have traditionally used to escape poverty. In the developed Western economies, in the East Asian tiger economies slightly differently, and in other regional and local examples that we know of. I'll leave you with just one final thought. Why is it that Jobra village in Bangladesh, where it all started in the 1970s, has had more microfinance than just about any other place on earth? Why is it that it remains trapped in very, very deep poverty and deprivation today? Surely that we would be seeing some signs of some exit strategy out of very deep poverty, but we actually don't see that. So I've run very quickly through that. So there we go.